Only in America do we believe anything is possible. Like a kid with a stutter from modest beginnings in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and Claremont, Delaware, sitting behind this desk in the Oval Office.
How will Joe Biden be remembered? Depends, and not just on where you're coming from politically, but when you're asking the question and when you're making the assessment. That's the conversation we're going to have. That, of course, was his farewell address to the nation after more than 50 years in public service. So, what is the legacy? Presidential historian and author Douglas Brinkley, as well as Democratic strategist Ameshia Cross, served in the Obama administration, both with me now. Happy New Year to both of you. Good to see both of you. So, Doug, what was your take on the substance and the style and delivery of the farewell? And how do you see the first blush of his reckoning?
Well, you have to keep in mind, he was really kind of riffing off of Dwight Eisenhower's famous farewell address of 1961, when Ike warned the country about the industrial military complex and even science complex. It was written by Malcolm Moos and Stephen Hess, and didn't make a lot of noise when Ike did it, but boy, has it lived on in history. And you're seeing tonight Joe Biden trying to say, worry about oligarchs, worry about big tech, worry that we're losing our democracy. The problem for him is, Chris, is that he has a 36% approval rating right now. When Eisenhower gave his farewell address in 61, he had a 60% approval rating. So I think the speech was well written by Biden, but I don't think it's going to be memorable. And it kind of sets up a thing. Anytime something goes wrong with an oligarch or a tech snafu, Biden can say, I warned you.
I agree. I understand. I have a follow, but I want to get something else. Ameshia, when you look at recent Democratic presidents, let's say from Carter till now, how does Biden stack up, in your opinion, to a Democrat?
Well, I think that much like Carter, President Biden's legacy is going to be remembered very differently years from now than it is today. I think that those approval ratings, much like Carter's, are not that great. I think that history in and of itself, when you look at the accomplishments, infrastructure, when you talk about the economy and where it stands by the numbers, when you talk about job creation, those are things, and his successes on the foreign policy front, those are things that are going to be talked about by historians for decades to come. But I do believe that this is a president who was up against some very severe headwinds. Quite frankly, a lot of those were driven by the pandemic and pandemic fatigue years after the pandemic was over, and that is largely affecting the mode at which people think about him right now. How does he stack up with other presidents? Obviously, if you're looking at approval ratings, again, I think that he would teeter on the not so great side when we talk about Democrats. But I think that if you are someone who is looking towards his actual ledger of wins, policy wins, as a first-term president, as someone who only had one term, those are not to be beaten by any of the recent Democratic presidents. He is light years ahead of them.
Ameshia made the point for us, Doug, which is how he's remembered is a function of when you're asking. I would have never thought when George W. Bush was done, I was like, well, that is a lack of ability to articulate and to sound like you have sophistication, the likes of which we will likely never see again. That's not true. Looking back at Bush now, you know, he's seen in a much more favorable light. Do you think that that is also what Biden can do? I don't see him having a Carter-like run because he doesn't have enough time to do all the things that Carter did with his life after the presidency.
Well, of course, Jimmy Carter left office in his 50s, so he could reinvent what an ex-president was, and did it, as we've been memorializing the last week, with fighting river blindness and guinea worm, and we go on and on. He won the Nobel Prize. The problem that Biden has is not just the age that you're looking. He's not a two-termer, so you do have to go back to Carter. But what did Carter give us in 1980? The Reagan Revolution, the dismantling of progressivism of the 60s. And now we're seeing Trump coming in and potentially doing the same thing. Yet Biden's in his 80s and doesn't quite have that rehabilitation time. George W. Bush, it does surprise me. He had 34% approval rating when he left office, but in contrast to Trump, he rose. He did paintings for wounded warriors. He rose, and he stayed in Dallas and kind of stayed out of national politics. His daughter Jenna is on NBC, and he was able to rise more than I would have suspected. And I do think Biden will rise too once we get a little bit of a year of Donald Trump.
While I have access to your brilliant mind, Ameshia Cross, and that is not just flattery, she really does have her finger on the pulse of what's going on with her party. How do you guys deal with the fact that the Trump administration is going to come in here and take credit for economic trends that started 8 and 12 months ago that, let's be honest, Biden and co. just didn't do a good job of arguing their own record? What do you do about that as Democrats?
I think there are lessons to be learned because this isn't the first time Donald Trump took credit for something that the Democrats set up before he got there. He did it after the Obama administration as well, which Biden happened to be a part of. I think that part of it is rapid response, being quick, reminding people, specifically at the state level, of what, Biden's relief projects post-pandemic, what the infrastructure development plan actually is going to be paying for when those projects start, how many jobs they're creating. It's up to the Democrats to get that messaging wheel turning, but also to be able to expand to the platforms where people are actually listening. One of the issues that Democrats had in the past election cycle was relying way too heavily, I would argue, on traditional media. And that's something that Republicans just did not do. So Democrats have to take a lesson from the past to be able to lead in the future, but also not be afraid to take those wins and to shout them out loud. Because
hey, thanks for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your screen. And don't forget, click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.